Dear online audience, they are trickling in at this point. Dear participants and my dear co-organizers, Dr. Navida Khan and Patty Maddox. Hello everyone and welcome to this roundtable on climate change and institutional imagination. The first online event of 3 in the Sawyer Climate Workshop Series, and it's brought to you by Johns Hopkins University and the Mellon Foundation. My name is Magnus Sigurdsson, and I'm a PhD candidate at Rice University studying social and cultural anthropology and doing research on institutional sites and practices of global climate governance. But today and currently, I'm back home in my home country, Iceland, where I'm working for the government on climate policy. I'm so happy to have the honor to moderate this roundtable over the next 2 hours with a set of brilliant participants, individuals who have been involved either through practical work and/or research in exploring how aspects of climate change dawn within governmental rationality. But before introducing our participants, I would like to say a few words about today's topic, which is at the same time quite specific, but also rather broad, which goes for climate change a lot of the time. And our topic is climate change and institutional imagination. When it comes to mainstream climate change discourse, we may be more familiar talking about climate politics rather than institutions that surround and take part in political systems. An increasingly dominant dimension of climate discourse today is directed towards the need for a political response, a rising global demand for clear and ambitious political decisions and actions on climate change. Now, a rather latent part of such discourse and discussion is the work that is carried out every day in institutions, for instance, institutions of governance on the local, national, and international levels. These institutions, they may execute political decisions, support political decision-making, and produce scientific knowledge and analysis. So we're here today to discuss this institutional dimension of the political, how institutions think about climate change, to paraphrase a famous anthropologist, Mary Douglas. Institutions, while often operating based on sharply defined legal mandates, do also play a role in imagining what the challenge of climate change looks like and what potential solutions, technologies, or procedures can help us tackle it. But enough from me at this point. I hope, at least about our topic, I hope it serves as a good initial framing for our discussion. But it's a broad discussion, and I would just encourage our participants to go wherever they want within it. And we'll never be able to talk about everything, but I look forward to having a great discussion with you. And I want to introduce our participants at this point, and I'm thinking about doing it in a chronological order, or I don't really know if you can call it a chronological order, but I'm going to go by time zones and start at 8 a.m. with my only fellow PhD candidate among the doctors around today's roundtable. Sarra Tekola, welcome. They are a PhD candidate in the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. Their dissertation research focuses on the connections between climate change and colonialism and Western society's inability to address the climate crisis, which they term the pathology of modernity. Their undergraduate research was on the physical elements of climate change, where they interned and researched for the EPA, NOAA, and the Washington State Department of Ecology. So lots of different institutions. They also have worked as legislative aide in the Seattle City Council, working on sustainability and justice policy. Sarra Tekola is both an academic and decolonial climate activist and Black Lives Matter organizer. They are a co-founder, co-director, and minister of activism for Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro. They were a lead organizer in Divest University of Washington, where after a 3-year struggle, they divested from coal. They helped to start a Block the Bunker campaign in Seattle that blocked another police station from being built in a community of color. And they started a campaign at Arizona State University that won a multicultural center. Their activism has been featured in Democracy Now!, CNN, Rolling Stone, and was named by Outside Magazine as one of 30 under 30 in 2016, and was a Ford Foundation pre-doctoral fellow from 2018 to 2021. We're so happy to have you here with us, Sarra Tekola. You've done such amazing work in activism, and I personally, I'm just really looking forward to reading your dissertation. And you're zooming in from Puerto Penasco, Mexico, where it's 8 a.m. in the morning. So thank you for waking up so early for us to let us move time zones. Normally, if we were doing this live, we would clap in between here, but we can't really do that. But we're all clapping in our minds. But let's shift time zones to our next participant, zooming in from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where it should be around 10 o'clock in the morning. Dr. Perrin Selcer is Associate Professor of History and the Program in the Environment and at the University of Michigan. He works at the intersection of science and technology studies and environmental history, and is the author of The Post-War Origins of the Global Environment, How the United Nations Built Spaceship Earth, published by Columbia in 2018. His current research project, The Holocene is History, explores human and environmental change at the last ice age from the perspective of the Anthropocene. His work has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, the National Science Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation. Thank you for being with us here today, Perrin Selcer.
Thank you for inviting me. I definitely am on the research side of the spectrum as opposed to the practical.
Thanks. And now let's take the biggest leap and go over the Atlantic, where we have two participants in the same time zone in the UK, or at least I think so, where the clock should be 3 p.m. in the afternoon, just like here in Reykjavik, Iceland. Dr. Joanna Depledge is fellow at the Cambridge Center for Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Governance. She has been following the climate change negotiations and global environmental politics more broadly for more than 25 years as a staff member of the UN Climate Change Secretariat, a reporter for the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, an independent consultant and an academic researcher affiliated with Cambridge University. Up until end 2020, Joanna was editor of the international peer-reviewed journal Climate Policy and is now a member of its editorial board. Joanna is also a founding member of Cambridge Zero, a member of the research network Climate Strategies, and sat on the steering committee of the production GAP report for 2020 and 2021. In 2017, she curated the Richard Kinley Gallery, the UNFCCC Story, a unique exhibition at the UN Climate Change Secretariat headquarters, documenting the history of the climate change negotiations. Joanna holds a PhD from University College London and is published widely on international climate change politics. And as an anthropologist that's been at the UNFCCC Secretariat, that gallery was quite the treasure chest to find. Thank you, Joanna, and thank you for being here with us today. And assuming that Joanna is in Cambridge, we're going to move down to London next. Also assuming that Dr. Hannah Knox is in London. Dr. Hannah Knox is Professor of Anthropology at University College London. Her research broadly focuses on the relationship between technical infrastructures and social life, and she has conducted ethnographic studies on various topics, including the place of digital technologies in post-industrial urban development, road construction and the state in Latin America, and the governmental challenges of climate change mitigation in the UK and Europe. She has published several books, including her most recent monograph, Thinking Like a Climate, Governing a City in Times of Environmental Change, published by Duke University Press very recently in 2020. Hannah Knox, thank you for being here with us today. And finally, we go to Bonn, Germany, where the UN Climate Change Secretariat is located. And the time should be around 4 p.m. in the afternoon over there. Dr. Youssef Nassef leads the work on adaptation to climate change under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And he has led the adaptation work streams under the UNFCCC since their inception. He possesses over 30 years of experience in diplomacy and international environmental policy, and is a seconded diplomat from the Egyptian Foreign Service. While assuming progressively higher levels of leadership at the UNFCCC, he led UNFCCC support for several initiatives on adaptation. These include the inception and support for national adaptation programs of action and national adaptation plans, the Nairobi Work Program, an international knowledge hub for impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation, and the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. He recently created the Resilience Frontiers Initiative, which applies foresight for attaining post-2030 resilience. He holds a PhD in International Technology Policy and Management and an MALD in International Environmental Policy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, as well as an MA in Middle East Studies and a BS in Computer Science and Physics from the American University in Cairo. Dear Youssef, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today.
Thank you, Magnus. I've never imagined I'm the easternmost participant here.
Yes, you are in a couple of ways. I'm looking forward to hearing you speak about institutional imagination. We have a set of marvelous participants, as you can hear, and there's a slight lean towards the important level of international politics, but I trust that Hannah and Sarra keep us anchored to the localities, and of course also these levels, global and local, are always entangled, and I think we might even get a chance to discuss that. As you can hear from the discussions, we have kind of way too much knowledge and experience around the table. We could probably talk about climate change for a week or so, but sadly, we just have 2 hours, but that's a lot of time too. I'm going to try to moderate us across 4 or 5 topics of discussion, and then we'll try to leave 13 minutes for a Q&A session with the audience towards the end. So please forgive me if I use my moderating powers and try to maneuver our discussions a bit. Before we delve into our first topic, and although I have introduced everyone at this point, I would like to go a quick tour de table, allowing all of our participants to say hello. And I would also ask you to tell us how climate change first entered into your professional lives. And I'm thinking about going the other way around now and starting with Youssef Nassef in Bonn. Youssef, you have the floor.
Thanks, Magnus. I mean, the way climate change entered into my life isn't part of the bio you read, actually. It was the late 80s. I got a job in the middle of the desert where there was a research center that's called the Desert Development Center, part of the American University in Cairo, where they're doing sustainability experiments, including using renewable energy and trying to do cutting edge organic agriculture and regeneration, stuff I hadn't heard about before. And it's this island in the middle of the desert trying to apply these forward-looking principles to a very arid environment. And then suddenly I started imagining, there's my institutional imagination, started imagining if this type of thinking, not necessarily the practices, if everyone started thinking in this way, wow, this would be a great world. Suddenly, after I hear about this problem, the climate change crisis, and I happen to be starting my graduate work at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Boston, and it sort of went in the opposite direction of my aspirations for a better world. We're supposed to transform into one direction, but here's what's happening: we're moving in the other direction. Got really interested in that went back and became a negotiator for the Egyptian climate team. And then from there got into the UN, hoping that this would be the opportunity to reverse that direction, not just to undo the damage, but see what one can do in order to inspire the transformation to a very different world. And that's the essence of the initiative you talked about, Resilience Frontiers. So that's the focus of my thinking nowadays, which is not just change, but replacement. And maybe I'll allude to that a bit in dealing with the evolution. You asked me to talk about the history of the process, but you didn't say if it's past history or future history. So I'll try to address both.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you, Youssef. Hannah.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So yeah, I mean, as from the little kind of biography that you gave of me, I came to climate change after having been researching some quite different topics. So prior to kind of being introduced to climate change as a topic of research, I'd been doing work looking at road construction in Latin America and really trying to understand relationships between people in the state and how they become mediated through these big infrastructure projects. And that had got me into really having a lot of conversations with engineers about engineering as a form of practice, what that was as a way of kind of relating to the material conditions in which one finds oneself. And so kind of having done that project, I was interested in kind of continuing those conversations with engineers. And it was really actually through conversations with engineers in the UK, in Manchester, where I ended up doing a lot of my research, that they expressed to me that what they were kind of spending their time thinking about was the problem of climate change and how as engineers they needed to kind of rethink the problem of how to engineer the built environment, how to engineer buildings in the context of increasing scientific evidence about global carbon emissions. And so it was being led by a kind of preoccupation of engineering and technology and infrastructure development rather than by environmental concerns in the first place that I came into becoming really interested in what happens when climate science becomes part of the challenge of how you think about the future and how one engages in questions about what development means and who development is for and how that might actually be achieved in kind of everyday material practices. So this taken me on this sort of like skewed the direction in which I've worked into kind of different kind of disciplinary space in many respects, but there's a direct kind of link there to previous work.
Thank you. Yeah, it's super interesting how certain problems can create knowledge. Like engineering is a type of knowledge, but then needs to shape itself around a problem of climate change. Thank you, Hannah. And Joanna, if you would be next for us.
Yes, thank you, Magnus, and greetings to everybody. It's fantastic to be here today. That's a very interesting question about how I got into climate change. I think that I literally grew up with the rise of the global environmental agenda. The year of my birth was the year that the UN Environment Programme was funded, that we had the UN Conference on the Human Environment, 1972. I became an adult at the age of 18 when the climate change negotiations were launched in 1990. So in a sense, my entire childhood, school, career, we were literally just at that point being introduced to the problems, mostly of deforestation and ozone layer depletion and gradually climate change. I started studying climate change more broadly from a development lens when I did a master's on development studies at LSE, and I was all set to do a PhD on urbanization in Brazil when I was fortunate enough to have to be granted an internship at the UN Secretariat in Bonn, and then having started working with some wonderful colleagues in Bonn on the climate negotiations, I threw away that PhD on urbanization in Brazil and did it on the Kyoto Protocol negotiations instead. And I think, like many of us, once we start working on climate change and the climate change negotiations, it's the bug that never really leaves one. You can never really drop climate change once it enters into your blood. So the rest is history, really. And indeed, that's my main interest at the moment, especially in this year of 30th anniversary of the adoption of the Climate Change Convention. I have a real interest in history and how much things have changed or not changed as the case may be. So I hope to speak to some of those historical themes of change over time when it gets to my slot. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. I'm at least very happy that you changed your dissertation topic. It's been very useful to have your writing on the climate regime.
Thank you for that.
Perrin, Selcer.
Yeah, thank you. That was interesting to hear everybody got involved. I'm not sure that I'm working on climate change in particular right now even, but it's where the forum in which I am often presenting my work, and I'm engaged with it all the time because I'm interested in questions of the global environment, the global scale, how we come to see and make this global something that we can, we don't experience in our day-to-day lives at all, but it's something that I can spend, evenings lying awake worrying about. And so how do we create that kind of a global scale consciousness, around the world and make it a central issue, the global environment and international forums. And that's the framework in which we do that now is climate and climate kind of, and so I'm interested in how climate emerged as the, ultimate global scale environmental issue. And I got into it through my dissertation work, actually, researching the history of science at the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the sort of post-war development expertise that's coming out of that. And was writing a dissertation, a bunch of different kind of case studies, and it wasn't, the dissertation was a bunch of case studies, chapters that came together. And in the defense, one of my advisors was like, what you're writing about is the creation of this global scale thing. And it was at that moment that I realized that, oh, that's what I'm interested in. This is how this all sticks together. And that turns out to be the global scale climate in our current world.
Thanks. That was great. It's so interesting to hear everyone just to give this a bit more context to where they're coming from. And we'll finish with Sarra Tekola.
Yeah, I would say that when I entered the field, I was working for the Department of Ecology doing restoration ecology work. I was also interning at a wildlife rehab, and I just started my environmental science degree. And I was debating whether or not to go into restoration ecology or wildlife biology. And then I realized that essentially with climate change, it didn't really matter which field I would go into. And the more that I also got into social justice, I realized with climate change, essentially nothing else mattered, because if we don't deal with climate change, it's going to affect the ecologies I was working with. It's going to affect all of the animals I was working with. And, people are also going to be greatly affected, and that it's a threat multiplier, and it's going to harm the most vulnerable. And so when I saw that, I realized it doesn't really matter what in environmental sciences my interest was. If I didn't make climate change my focus, I wasn't really looking at the whole picture, because this is a defining issue of our time. And so it felt like it was critical that it then become my focus, even adding the other intersectional layers that I was also interested in.
Thank you, Sarra. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, just drawing out how all-encompassing the issue is and how it touches upon everything, and it can be quite overwhelming at times, not only ethically and morally and politically, but also just from a schematic point of view. It touches upon so many things. How are we supposed to talk about it and imagine it? And of course, not one thing, it's many things. So thank you all very much for this. And now we'll kind of dive into our first topic, which is climate change within specific institutional settings. And we're going to be, that sounds pretty broad, but I wanted to ask the question, what new forms of expertise and institutional practices you've seen appearing in the response to climate change, or what kind of expertise and practices have you been a part of developing and facilitating? In a way, we're just continuing from these introductions, hearing a bit about your experience with climate change and institutions. And I know some of you have a large pool of examples to pick from. So just hearing a specifically significant example would be wonderful. But others have also, I know, looked at the whole spectrum. And Hannah, in your research, you did that to some extent in Manchester, looked at a lot of different knowledge practices. I wanted to start this topic with hearing from you, Hannah Knox.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, maybe it's just helpful to give a bit of context. So the research that I have done around climate change was centered around a kind of long-term ethnography of a kind of project of a network of people based in and around the city of Manchester, but also many of whom are working in kind of national and European contexts as well, to try to explore how the city, in this case, this particular city, but also cities in general, could respond to the challenge of how to reduce carbon emissions. The focus very much being on climate change mitigation. And one of the way that I was working was really by spending time with people in very kind of mundane settings, in the kind of details of their everyday practices, trying to understand like how people were confronting the challenge of climate change. I think I started by being interested in what were the kind of maybe the sort of unforeseen social consequences of doing climate change mitigation, but actually what really emerged from the research was that everybody I was spending time with was really posing questions about the boundaries or the limits of their own activities or practices that they were engaged in. And I think there were three main kind of areas of expertise where I found people having a lot of conversations about the question of what it was to tackle climate change in the context of their institutional setting. So these were the context of kind of administration and bureaucracy. Firstly, from the position of science or climate science, and from the position of climate activism, and these were kind of three positions that people would take up, and they weren't even necessarily completely separate from one another. So within a kind of administrative setting, there were many people who had a background degrees in environmental science and a kind of impetus to work as climate activists. So it wasn't necessarily that these people were very divided into separate kind of categories, but these were sort of three subject positions that people were struggling with. And so within the kind of administrative role that people were taking, there was a real kind of question mark over the extent to which a problem like climate change could be encapsulated or pursued within the existing institutional structures of bureaucratic work. And a lot of this is around kind of boundary crossing and like thinking about the kind of categories of intervention. So if within a kind of local authority setting, which is where I did quite a lot of my research, one has a responsibility for a category like transport or neighborhoods, how do you suddenly sort of insert a problem like carbon emissions or climate change into those pre-existing structures and categories? And one of the things I think people were really, really struggling with in their work was how to justify action on climate change within pre-existing institutional structures and categories and processes. And so often a lot of the work that people were doing was having to kind of twist things that were to do with climate change into pre-existing activities. So reducing carbon emissions in buildings was okay as long as it was about fuel poverty or it was about reducing the cost of running a building. On its own, it wasn't sufficient to be able to tackle climate change. And I think that was how to do that, and how to do that work of kind of doing one thing but being seen to do another thing was one of the kind of expertise that people were cultivating within that setting. I think when it comes to the climate activists and the scientists, there were other challenges that they were experiencing. With the scientists who were involved in the research that I was doing, and I think it's something that we see more broadly as well, there was a real kind of question mark over the boundaries between science and activism. So to what extent should science, those who are working with climate models, be responsible for articulating the findings of those models and inserting that into kind of policy processes? And again, the question for them around their expertise was, how does one make that move from being an expert in scientific analysis to being an expert in understanding what it means to communicate science, or what it means to participate in a policy process, or what it means to understand society and to think about kind of questions of justice, or questions of distribution, or questions of responsibility. So both those settings, there was definitely a sort of unsettling of expertise that I think has profound implications for then how the terrain of climate change action gets divided up, and who can inhabit different roles within that.
Thanks. Oh, that's wonderful. That's really rich, and a rich start to our discussion. Just this idea that you started out with, that climate change doesn't enter into an institutional vacuum. We've already imagined processes and topics that it needs to be fitted within. I think that's really interested in. And then this question of the positionality of certain civil servants or researchers within the political. I think in terms of roundtable dynamics, participants can raise their hands if they want the word, but if I don't see hands, I'll just give the word to a person I think might have something to say on the issue. I see Perrin's hand is up, so Perrin, you get the word.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. That was really interesting and really resonated with my research on the post-war international bureaucracy and their building of these institutions and grappling with the ways environmental issues cross the bureaucratic boundaries of the different, the specialized agencies. For example, like you've got your agriculture agency, you've got your international labor organizations, you've got your education, scientific and cultural organization, and the problems are supposed to be, for the competencies of those specific functional agencies within those functional boundaries. But the value of these problems in terms of institution building, in terms of creating relationships but across political and boundaries and boundaries of scale between local, national, and international governments is also that they overflow those boundaries. So they create a need for cooperation there. And the thing that I found really surprising in my work was what you were talking about, was just, or seemed like it was in what you were talking about. I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it. It's just how important the bureaucratic politics of policing turf, making sure that your career and that your portfolio is growing, but also then wanting to cooperate, because that's what the whole thing's about, and recognizing that these problems are so multifaceted. I was surprised at how much the stuff we don't like to talk about bureaucracy, really determined a lot of what was going on versus the more glamorous international and global politics, or even the disciplinary politics of scientists. So what's your reaction to that? What kind of how big a role do these preset, as Magnus said, institutional boundaries have in kind of shaping the climate programs that you were looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these institutional boundaries were in some respects kind of inscribed in the kind of structure of the organization itself, but they were also being reproduced by the people who were inhabiting particular kinds of roles. And I think that some of those kinds of more intangible qualities of like who thinks that it's their responsibility to work on a particular topic, or even that it's in their domain, and how that's kind of related to a sense of kind of identity was also really important. So I remember at one point, like people talking about making a division between work on climate change and work on other green issues and biodiversity issues. And that separation was kind of constantly being made in terms of a hierarchy of importance within an institutional setting. So people would tell me that like climate change was kind of serious and expert and hard, and it was like populated by men and by engineers, and stuff to do with biodiversity was the kind of soft stuff. It wasn't really like something that as a local authority one could take kind of responsibility for, and that was kind of inscribed into the kind of capacities of the people working in those roles to make a difference and to articulate and voice kind of open, like where openings could be for actions on climate change to happen. So I think that definitely these sort of existing institutional structures were really kind of powerful in terms of opening or closing doors to certain kinds of changes being able to happen. And I think we're at a moment now, actually, I'm still kind of continued to do some work in this context within these sort of local authority settings in the UK. And there's been, you know, a lot of these institutions have made claims now that towards kind of cutting carbon emissions or reaching net zero by a particular point in time, and are appointing people into positions of being responsible for that climate change work. And I think it's a kind of interesting moment to understand, like, who is it who's being appointed into those positions, and that then tells you a lot about what kinds of activities they're going to promote and what kinds of activities they're going to pursue. And I think often probably many of those positions are not necessarily being inhabited by people who have a strong agenda around climate justice, for example. I think often it's sort of dominated by targets and accounting and reductions in carbon emissions, but maybe leaving out some of the other side of what this kind of people who are working on climate change more broadly are recognizing is also crucial to the actions on climate change.
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking. Well, I wanted to mention with the hand function that Joanna just told me she has a problem with it. So if you have a problem with it, just send me a comment and ask for the word, like a direct message. That's exactly what Joanna has done. So I'm going to give her the word next. Just to give a slight intro into the climate negotiations, when you're talking about these divisions of topics, it seems to apply, it has great resonance with how vast the system is under the climate negotiations, with lots of different versions of climate change and different implications that delegates need to talk about. And I think for a general audience and people that just follow this through the media, they think the negotiations happen in one room and they're just talking about climate change, but they're actually talking about, 50 different versions of climate change in lots of different rooms. So I'd love to hear your take on this discussion, Joanna.
Oh, that's great, Magnus. I actually just wanted to follow on, though, if I may, from what Han and Perrin were saying, which I think, to be honest, really goes to the heart of our discussion today, which is, where does climate change sit in institutions? And I mean, there's local institutions, local governments, national governments, and now you've also raised international, so national delegations. Because there's always been this call internationally that delegations sent by countries should cover more than environment ministries, because traditionally, nationally, climate change has been discussed by, well, initially meteorological, so the science ministries very early on in the 1990s, and then the environment ministries started to take over. And there's often been this call that, oh, we need the economics ministries, we need the finance ministries to get involved. Otherwise, we're never going to get any change. And I think, I don't know any government that's really managed to resolve this question of where institutionally do we put climate change? Because Hannah, you've talked now about people being appointed to kind of climate change positions. Well, what does that mean? Sometimes if you have a climate change ministry, or you have your sustainability officer or your climate change department, they get siloed off. Yeah, climate change, then it stays as an add-on. whereas climate change should not be an add-on. It should be mainstreamed across the entirety of our institutions. It should be like health and safety, in my view. It should be something that cuts across absolutely everything. And I'm just thinking about the experience of the UK, where we started off with a department for the environment that looked after climate change. Then we had a department for climate change. Now that's gone, and now climate change is in the Department of Industry and Innovation. And I guess I just wanted to throw that out, this kind of thing. Where is climate change, and where should it be? So that was my response here. So no, I haven't really talked about the international. Don't worry, I'm sure I'll talk about that later. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great, Joanna. I'm going to give the word next to Youssef. I think he's in a great position to answer that, and kind of also going into our second topic, thinking about the history of climate policy, and then we'll go to Sarra after Youssef. Youssef, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. And I thought what Joanna says is a nice segue to talking about a bit of the evolution of the climate regime. She's absolutely right. In the first few years, it was mostly dominated by meteorologists, environment people. Around the time of when the MDGs became a bit more prominent, you kept hearing people saying, "Oh, this is a developmental issue. Climate change is something under development. It's no longer environment." Then we entered into this new phase where since 2018, 2019, when you saw the IPCC report on warming of 1.5 and then the biodiversity report, the global assessment, and both said, basically, if you don't transform in the next few years, you're doomed. So it suddenly changed the mindset. You say, oh, it's no longer really environmental, it's no longer developmental either. And people started saying existential. And it's a buzzword that's going around and no one's able to define what it is. And that takes me to your original question, which is what kind of skill one would need to look at this. And 5 or 10 years ago, I would have told you multidisciplinarity, because this is such a wicked problem that needs you to know so many things. It needs you to interface policy with science. You need to know economics and politics and psychology and meteorology and physics, so many things to be able to grasp it properly. But now I would say something totally different. To be equipped for that transformation, you need foresight skills. You need institutional imagination, a word I learned only from this, the title of this meeting, and a massive paradigm shift. We talked about in the introductions, you mentioned the pathology of modernity, but there's really also a pathology of mindset and of worldview. Interestingly, the best direction that I feel could help us in adjusting our worldview comes from indigenous communities and the way they interface with nature. There's so much to learn there in collectivity, connectivity, intergenerational equity. Right now, much of our educational systems, the way we do things, we have an international setup to handle a global problem. That's a mismatch. It's not a global setup handling a global problem. International means each country fends for itself and looks at its own well-being, and the sort of climate change is the reason they're there, but they're still intent on preserving what it is that maintains their competitiveness. So one of the biggest shifts, I think, that is needed in this new era that we're in, this existential era of climate change, is moving away from a problem/solution mentality towards a creative design one. So let's not look at plugging holes. I mean, someone was saying how climate change is so overarching and linked to everything else, but there's another extension to that, and that you can see since the 70s, we've been churning out one problem after the other, you know, air pollution, ozone depletion, species extinction, biodiversity loss, climate change, now pandemics. We can continue looking at each one by itself, but whatever engine we have that keeps producing these will continue. It might be, climate change might be the flavor of the month now, but there might be more things coming ahead. So it is a time to actually zoom out and not look at climate change by itself, but look at these underlying, I want to say systemic, it's beyond that, it's paradigmatic. Our paradigmatic relationship with nature, our extractive approach to life, the very fact that we say something like ecosystem services reveals how we look at our relationship with nature, right? And so that's why I say, I mean, the main skill we need, and I sort of hid within it the evolution of the process now, is one of foresight, one of not systemic change, but paradigmatic change, one that basically moves away from out of the box towards a no box approach to these issues. And finally, one that does not merely say that the approach we should take is one that retains your action within planetary boundaries, but the whole concept of planetary boundaries is dependent on our unsustainable use of our resources. So once you make a shift, you could be expanding the capacity of your planet to accommodate more people. If each human on Earth adds more value to nature than they take away from it, then the whole concept of overpopulation changes in your head. So, so basically, it's a shift in mindset that is the main talent that we need to get, and a capacity to dispense with the cognitive biases that get us to imagine that it is impossible to do that transformation and move away from a world that keeps producing things like climate change and many other crises. Thanks.
Thank you, Youssef. Just like I thought, time is just rushing by, but I think we're already having a great conversation, and now we're kind of transitioning into thinking about social change. I love this idea that we need the paradigm shift. I'd love to give the word over to Sarra and hear her views on this and the discussions we've had already.
Yeah, I think that's a great transition. I couldn't agree more about this need for a change in mindset, and that's really what the pathology of modernity is about. It's about this mentality of that Western civilization has had, a mentality of extraction and domination that has been in use since colonialism, and we see it continued forward with much of what we're seeing on the international and national scale is reinforcing the dominant hegemony of Western imperial rule. And so with things like carbon trading, we're seeing land grabs and other things that essentially reinforces the global North, global South divide. And so when we look at what is needed for a just transition on the national scale, I argue it is reparations for the harm done since colonialism, and that continues with globalization. And yet oftentimes when that is brought up, we're told that it is unrealistic, that it could not happen. And yet without that, how is the global South supposed to do the leapfrog development that we're asking them to do so that they can develop in ways that, the richest country in the world, the United States, hasn't even developed in, and it's going to require a huge transfer of wealth, which, under this current paradigm, it would mean that they go further into debt and thus further entrenched in more of this control by the Western countries. And so without the change in our mentalities, and thus that would allow for this transfer of wealth and allow for the change in the paradigms, I think some of the most promising scales where we can move towards what Youssef was talking about, this kind of more nature-centered or indigenous-led changes. I think one of the best ways we can do that is on the local scale. And we've seen beautiful examples on the local scale. I can speak to, like in California, we're seeing that in some cases that the departments of ecologies are actually giving the land back to the indigenous communities who are better able to manage the land in such a way that addresses the fire regimes and addresses, reduces the wildfires. And then I think that there are also other examples, one that I'm actually working on locally in Arizona, and the idea of a people's budget. And so the work there is really about shifting the budget priorities, which right now are about profits over people, where across the United States, the majority of fundings locally on the city level goes to the police. And then we're told that we don't have money to afford climate change and sustainability. And most departments fund sustainability at the least amount. And so when we look at how do we change this, it is, again, a change in the mentality where we have to determine that sustainability is more important than the police, which are really about protecting property. And when we look at not just that, but another shift that we're seeing on the local level is these climate resiliency officers or departments we're starting to see pop up on city scales. And so with climate resiliency officers, we're looking at actually someone whose job is to address two of the most pressing problems that we're facing, both inequality and climate change. And so when they look through the communities and try to address the communities most impacted, which are so often communities of color, try to essentially build up the social safety net so that when climate disasters continue to happen, as we're seeing, that communities will be stronger overall. And so I think resiliency is a great framework, because when we look at it through there, that really builds out the space for the institutional imagination, because I think we get into the dream space where we can dream up things that we never thought of. And so when we look at, okay, now that we're looking at through a resiliency lens, then we also have to look at some of our pressing problems like homelessness, which is increasingly becoming an issue. And then when we have environments like Arizona, for example, and the heat, it's becoming deadly to be exposed to the outdoors. And so now we have to address an issue that probably wasn't seen as connected to climate change prior, like homelessness, but now is a climate issue when we take on the lens of resiliency. And I think that is where we can start to build the blueprints of the world that we want to see. And it really opens up the institutional imagination.
Wow, thank you, Sarah. That was super inspiring, and bringing also just concreteness into this discussion, real examples of how climate change is affecting localities and populations, and how the social is intrinsically imbued in discussing about the environment or climate change. And I'd like to transition a bit into, or keeping with the social issues, transitioning into our third topic, thinking about how institutional imaginations and public conceptions overlap and don't overlap. But before that, I'm wondering whether, Perrin, you'd maybe give us a bit of history in terms of the environment concept. Have these social implications always been there, or is this a new development, how it's being brought into this much bigger and deeper societal context?
Yeah, that was really interesting. I have lots of questions for both Youssef and Sarah. And it was fascinating to hear the importance of the change of mentality, being at the center of this, and imagining what that means for the UN framework, what those institutions, how they would have to change like this, the focus on the local that Sarah is talking about, and the the resiliency framing I thought was really interesting too. I have lots of questions about this and the limits of resiliency too as a way of framing this versus sort of a justice framing. But let me try and answer Magnus's question. So I see the global scale environmental issues, emerging out of institutions that were built right after World War II. I think is a really good starting point for this story. And looking at the generation that then ended up culminating in the Stockholm Conference, or the UN Conference on the Human Environment that Joanna referenced earlier in 1972, which is at the 50th anniversary of that now. And that's really where the global scale environment became this pressing international issue. One of the things that the UN and these international organizations really made central to politics. And it is an incredible achievement, really, to make something as abstract as the global scale environment, climate change, a pressing matter of international negotiations and concern. Because even thinking about something like, how do you know 1.5 degrees change in the global climate, like who's experiencing that? Who knows it? How do you make that kind of knowledge? Is an important question that we shouldn't overlook. And I think it is this post-war generation that built what we call, in my field, international knowledge infrastructure that can produce global scale environmental knowledge. And these guys, mostly guys, but there were some women, motivated not really by a sense of environmental crisis, but they were motivated by the horrors of World War II and by this global political crisis. And they had deeply held internationalist ideals coming out of that war, and saw the crisis and the horrors of tens of millions of people dying as the fundamental cause of that. In many of their views was that individuals did not understand their relationship to the world community. They did not understand that we lived in a global economy and a global society, and our political institutions weren't at that scale. So instead of looking at the local scale, like Sarah's calling for now, and I totally endorse, especially since the national and global is so distressing at the moment, they said, people have to really be aware that they're part of this world community. So how do you cultivate world citizens is what they were after. And many of them were guided by a kind of a theory of power and political change called functionalism. And the idea here was that you got people working together to solve mundane problems. You kind of ignored the ideological disputes. You try to get off those kind of issues that have so much conflict around them. You get people working together to solve problems like, well, the COVID pandemic would be a great example of this, an infection, where you have to control it. It's going to spread, and it's going to, you can't stop it at just the local level, but it takes cooperation to get a handle on this. Or integrated river basin development, another one of their main concerns, because those rivers cross political boundaries, and you have to manage them across those boundaries if you're going to make the most use of rivers, stuff like that. They thought of it as creating a moral equivalent of war, in William James's term. And the idea was you rallied people for a war against nature. That's literally the language that is used here. And it's this development regime that comes out of this. So focusing on international development and knowledge sharing is going to create a sense of world community. And they were focused on that. And through that, building this international bureaucracy. And since these international institutions would be providing services like controlling pandemics and creating development, people, citizens, and nations these international institutions would earn their loyalty. So that they would then, sort of the embryo of the United Nations would grow into a legitimate functioning world government. And it's interesting in the context of this because bureaucracy here is not seen as something that gets in the way. But it's like, you have deep ideals when you go and you work for this bureaucracy, and building the bureaucracy is a goal in itself. I would say even the UN Conference on the Human Environment in 1972, the key organizers of that, they looked at it as a way of saving the United Nations more than saving the planet, because the UN was in a sense of crisis then. This was coming after the 1960s development decade. You have decolonization and new nations really feeling like they do deserve a bigger piece of the economic pie, but development in the 1960s hadn't delivered quickly enough. You've got the UN marginalized in the Cold War as an international security organization. And people saw the environment as a place where the UN could prove its worth and could kind of mobilize this kind of cooperation. And so the UN Environment Program comes out of that, and this sort of birth of global environmental scale issues. So that's, so in the end, it all goes back to social psychology, and a change of mentality coming out of World War II gives us this birth of the global scale environment. I will just say one last thing is that these guys were not global, global climate change was not their issue when they were building this international law of infrastructure. They saw all the pathologies of modernity. Those all were rooted actually in the soil, and they were worried about soil erosion as the key kind of overarching phenomenon where all of modernity's sins, could be seen in the degradation of soils, and that ends up, global climate change has very different implications than that. So I can talk more about that, or we can move on to further conversations.
Yeah, I think we could all talk for a much longer time with each other, and I just encourage that we kind of we'll be in touch after the roundtable too, to keep some of the conversations going. We can't maybe pick up within the 2 hours. I'm really liking that Sarra Tekola's pathologies of modernity is picking up kind of in our discussion. But I think we would shift to Joanna now and talk about how does the political issue of climate change appear to these civil servants and institutions and policymakers and activists, maybe thought on the other side, kind of on the public side, although it doesn't have to be like that way, like Hannah was talking about earlier. So yeah, Joanna, I think I'm just going to give you the ball.
Thank you very much for giving me the ball, Magnus. I may throw it in slightly unexpected directions, partly because I've been very much inspired by what I've been hearing, partly because some of the things I was going to say have actually been superseded. Can I just follow on very briefly from what Perrin was saying, which was absolutely music to my ears with my interest in the history. Perrin, you mentioned how the environment emerged onto the agenda partly as a way of saving international bureaucracy of the United Nations, which obviously is absolutely true. And then, of course, climate change emerged onto the agenda as a way of bringing the East and the West together at the end of the Cold War. So precisely in the late 1980s, it was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Geopolitics was in a complete mess, and climate change and the environment more broadly was seen as a way in which it was seen as a kind of easy issue, as something that everybody could agree on, a way of getting Russia and the US together. So, I mean, there's some great snippets of speeches made by Reagan and then Bush and Gorbachev that specifically reference working together on climate change. So it's very interesting how I think from the beginning, globally, climate change tried to be one of these motherhood and apple pie issues that would actually bring people together. And it's interesting to see how that hasn't, well, wholly come to pass. I'm really interested in this issue of a new mindset from Sarra and Youssef, and I think we have to see, I completely agree, but we have to see how difficult that is given the structures that operate in our world. And I'm thinking here internationally, we live in a world of sovereign states. And we have done for a long time, the Westphalian system, and sovereignty is very much supreme internationally. And this brings in competition between states, political competition, economic competition. And we see that in the climate negotiations very often. You mentioned, Magnus, that we talk about climate change in the climate change negotiations. I would say that very often we don't talk about climate change in the climate change negotiations. Very often it's actually wider geopolitical issues that get played out there. So we do have this, we are trying to solve, in a sense, a global problem against this background of sovereignty, also against this background, which Sarra alluded to, of the dominance of economic growth. So in very concrete terms, the way in which countries measure their success and their kind of hierarchy is according to GDP. That is almost universally the case. I mean, there are other indicators. We know we have a Human Development Index, we have what Bhutan's Happiness Index, but these are very minor compared with economic growth. So if every country in the world is measuring its performance based on economic growth, then that completely puts a brake on these new imaginings and mindsets that we are talking about. So we need work on very concrete ways in which we can turn this around. In most countries, we have a system of competitive politics. So, you know, democracy is the best system that we have. I think we would all agree with that. But the fact is that even in the democratic system, you have competition between political parties. You have individuals, political parties compete to be re-elected every 4 or 5 years. And this, again, is very difficult when you are trying to instigate change that will impact on certain communities, that will impact on powerful political interests. If you want to be re-elected, it is difficult to take bold decisions on climate change when the benefits won't be felt for many years hence. I mean, we know this, but again, we have to remember these structures that make it much more difficult to act. And internationally, I have an interest in the practice of diplomacy, as you know, and I often think that are diplomatic negotiations really the best way of resolving this problem? Because diplomacy, the essence of diplomacy is finding a consensus. It's finding a middle ground, right? It's not necessarily finding what is the best solution on climate change, what is the cheapest solution, what is the most just solution. That's not it. It's simply finding consensus between the interests of different countries who are in competition for the reasons I've just said, and then you usually tend to the lowest common denominator. So again, we are fighting against these kind of structures of diplomacy. So that is a difficult situation that we face. So how we actually develop and implement these new mindsets, I think, is difficult. I think it's especially difficult when you ask me how different institutions conceive of climate change. You asked about policymakers, you asked about activists, you asked about individuals. And I would say, just focusing on the individual now, all individuals have their different concepts. Climate change means different things to different individuals. It means something different to a farmer in Africa. It means something different to an urban dweller in London, whether you're rich or poor, a whole range of different things. And I see this talking to my colleagues, just talking to my friends who don't know anything about climate change. How they view it is fundamentally shaped by where they come from. So there is no, I think, working towards a single mindset, change in mindset, I think will be difficult. I think that's just to slightly put a bit of realism on that, while noticing it's clearly what we do need. What I had wanted to just point to in terms of changes over time in how we conceptualize climate change, we've talked a lot about this broadening of the climate change agenda, so from a kind of scientific, technical problem through to a political one, a developmental one, and now very much with this justice lens. And I think we've very much seen that internationally over time, about how the actual agenda, the physical number of items on the agenda, how that has broadened, and how the language that we see in the climate change treaties and the climate change decisions has changed towards a recognition of well, maybe not human rights to some extent, but certainly climate justice. I hadn't thought about this new extension, Youssef, to an existential mindset. That's definitely, I think, the next stage up. I wonder, yeah, so to the extent that climate change has become the ultimate issue, what you said, Perrin, and all the defining issue of our time, Sarra. So I kind of get the sense now that tackling climate change has become like a slogan for a better world. It's like the climate change agenda is now being almost expected to save all the world's problems, to solve all the world's problems about equity, about poverty, about injustice, about discrimination. And that's great, but I wonder if that doesn't become a bit unmanageable for this process that we have. And I do worry sometimes that because we are, through climate change, are trying to change the world for the better in every way, we would end up doing none of these things. But that's just a personal worry that I have. Something that we haven't really talked about is how the climate change agenda has also been narrowed somewhat. And I'm thinking here, you put it in the agenda that we saw, about the 2-degree targets, about the 1.5-degree targets, and about net zero. And I think it's really fascinating how this entire complexity we've been talking about now seems to be boiled down to one number, to 1.5, or one phrase, net zero. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I think what it reveals is the fact that individuals and institutions find it very difficult to deal with the complexity of climate change. Psychologically, as human beings, we don't really have the capacity to compute all of this. And so people like to bring it down to this one single number or phrase. And, you know, I don't know what others think, but certainly I feel that the 1.5 and net zero have been very useful as kind of rallying cries for institutions, for individuals to gain support for stronger climate action more broadly, however that might be perceived. And in this, I wanted to bring in another institution that we haven't talked about, which is a business and industry. And I think this is where we have seen real changes in that particular institution. Of course, it's not homogenous, but real change over time, when in the 1990s, early 2000s, in a climate change negotiation setting, you could almost guarantee that the business and industry NGOs would be against strong climate action. They would be there to try and, you know, maybe slow down or be more cautious. Nowadays, you have a big swathe of businesses who are genuinely, and I think it is genuine, trying to promote stronger action. And I think that is a very interesting change. And you can talk about greenwashing, you can talk about lack of sincerity. That's true, but I think that is a really important institutional change we should be pleased about. Now, I'm sure there's more that I'd like to say, but I would just like to end this little intervention by adding in another quality to what Youssef said that people need nowadays to tackle climate change. I thought everything you said was absolutely right. And I think we also need optimism, because I think at the moment we're in the situation where the future looks bleak, it looks gloomy, emissions are still rising, we are facing this existential crisis, but we do need a good dose of optimism, and there is reason to be positive. We do now have, you know, net zero targets amongst 83 countries in the world, and maybe even more. I just looked up the statistics today, and actually right now, in the UK, about a quarter of our electricity is being generated by renewables right now as I speak, in winter. And I think this trend is repeated in many countries, certainly in Europe. So I think that there are definitely reasons to be positive and optimistic, and I would like to see maybe some of the institutions bringing up a little bit more of this positivity and the fact that, you know, change is happening, and there are reasons to be optimistic. So yes, I may well want to intervene on other points, but that's the kind of presentation I wanted to make to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. That was very rich, and so rich that I don't want to steer the discussion necessarily in one way or another. I'm sure the other participants have things they want to respond with. We talked about paradigm shifts. We talked about the power of this resilience concept. And now I think it's really important to get optimism on the table too. It sounds simple, but to be optimistic in a strategic and targeted way I think is super important, because it's also a short way over to kind of soft denialism when you have the wrong kind of optimism. So I think it's actually a big challenge to be optimistic in the right way. I feel like we should go now to Hannah Knox, which started us out in the first round. And I don't want to steer you too much, but I just saw at least one great resonance there, talking about targets and this way of simplifying policy into a single signifier, like 2 degrees. And then there were notes, you started out talking about economic growth too. There are lots of resonances with your work, Hannah Knox, if I give the floor to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've just like, my mind's buzzing. There's so much in this conversation that is so fascinating, and I agree with so many of the things people are saying. I mean, I think I'm going to come around to targets, but I'm going to come at it via the discussion about mindsets and changing kind of perception, because actually, so the book that I've written is called Thinking Like a Climate, and a lot of it is really trying to think about like what happens when people are confronted with an understanding of global climatic change through a confrontation with climate models, and how that is very profound, often the change that brings about, and the realization that brings about for people about the world that we are all living in and that they're living in. I think there's been a few moments in this conversation where people have said, once you start thinking about or working on climate change, you can't work on anything else. And certainly a lot of the people who I work with expressed exactly the same thing. And I think that's the same for me as well. So I think there is, and maybe that is a hopeful thing, that there is a kind of possibility of having this kind of shift in perception. But then, of course, it's also not straightforward that just by recognizing or understanding some of the relationships that are made visible through climate models, that then necessarily has a kind of knock-on effect that is beneficial for the climate. So to come back to the question of targets, I became really interested in the kind of that sort of double role, particularly around the idea of carbon budgets. So I was kind of observing both the political work that in this very local setting where I was working, there was a lot of work that had gone into like arriving at percentage reductions of carbon emissions that directly came from ideas about like what a global carbon budget was, and then what an appropriate local carbon budget was, and then how that was kind of negotiated, went back and forth with kind of political institutions to arrive at a particular number that could be politically palatable, as well as physically reasonable in terms of the global climate. But of course, we've seen like those kinds of carbon budgets then also have all kinds of unforeseen consequences to them. They become kind of tick boxes, or they become things that people can put in strategy, and they become kind of dislocated from whether or not those activities actually are going to make any difference to climate change. So recently I was involved in some conversations which were where there were some people in the room who were working in farming, and they were talking about how the whole carbon offsetting kind of economy was creating all these sort of perverse effects within the farming community. So people were like not doing tree planting on their land now, or not doing ecological projects, because in the future, if they'd done that, then they wouldn't be eligible for money for carbon offsetting in the future. And then all kinds of, it just raised so many questions. So I think these, but at the same time, these targets do also create a kind of, they also have effects. They have they have effects on creating a language. They have effects on channeling funds. So I think it's very, it's very complex. I think it's, I really agree that there needs to be this, there does need to be a change in mindset, but I don't think that is easy to do. And I think maybe when we talk about mindset, it's not just it's not like one universal worldview that is going to emerge where everybody just agrees, but more like a kind of gestalt shift where there's like a realization that one can see things differently, but the implications of that are going to be really different for different people in different places. So I've been thinking a lot about that. And then I just wanted to also come back on this point that Sarah raised about the local, which I just think is so important. And I really saw that one of the challenges of like actually doing, because a lot of the things that you need to do around climate change are like require that they're done in really local ways, in really local places. At the moment, there's a big debate in the UK about insulating houses. That's like a hyper local problem, even if it's going to come about partly because of national policy. And actually, when we think about climate change in terms of changing mindsets, that's also about building momentum and bringing people on board and getting people to understand why this might have anything to do with their own lives and like anything that they might be kind of concerned about. So in the UK, there's very little funding at a local level for anything to do with climate change. Local authorities are really underfunded, and massively more so now than 10 years ago. So there's very little capacity to act at that local level. And you can see a kind of comparison with other countries where actually at a local level, there's a bit more agency and there's more funding at that level. So I think finding a way of kind of not dismissing the fact that this is a global problem, but acknowledging that there's a real kind of possibility of doing things at, you know, at a more local level is maybe a source of hope or optimism as well.
I'm glad that we're all attempting to end like on a, or most of us trying to end on an optimistic note. I think that's nice. It's a difficult subject and raises lots of anxiety. So it's a challenge to get the optimism and the light into discussions about it. So thank you for that. I think if we were gonna follow my initial script I sent you all, where we had like 5 circles around the table, we would need at least 1 or 2 hours more. I think we'll only complete kind of 2 circles around the table, and I have Sarra and Youssef left in this round. I think I want to give the word to each of them, and then we'll open up for audience questions. The time really flies when you're having fun. Sarra or Youssef, I wonder if either one of you wants to grab the word. Sarra, do you want to start?
Okay.
You're so polite, both of you.
For sure. I guess I can start. So yeah, I think that we've touched on a lot here, and I think that where do I start? So one, I think something that I am often challenged with is like on one hand, the need for being realistic, and then on the other hand, the need for optimism. Because when I looked at the realities of what is realistic, right? I've touched on a little bit under, this current world order, the international climate deals and policies that we get realistically only give more power to corporations through scams like carbon trading and lies like net zero, which we see the issues at hand here, which are creating essentially business as usual. We're working towards a carbon colonialism where the global South will be forced to stay barefoot and in the dark with plenty of trees to pay for the West's ever expanding carbon budget. And so when we're told what is needed, is realistic, what we see is a further entrenchment into this carbon colonialism and where the westernmost richest countries that have benefited from colonialism continue to end up on top. And so oftentimes, the need for really a decolonization of our mentalities, again, is seen as not realistic, and then often looked at on the local level. We're told that, we have until 2030, according to the IPCC, to, peak our carbon emissions. And so, given the time scale here, the local is not fast enough. And yet, we've had 26 years of, the world coming together and really not a lot of progress. Not to insult those who've been working on the international scale, but we have to be honest about, what has happened even with the Paris Climate Accord. There was no regulating mechanism to really, no enforcement mechanism. And so carbon emissions continue to rise every year. And so that is why I think that the importance of the local, because, it took 21 years for the international community to sign the climate accord, only for it to be, completely ignored by the United States for another 4 years. And so that's why I think the importance of the local, but I also think that when we look at these issues, it's important to, on the national and international scale, we need to look at what we can do so that we can work on those scales. And there's a tremendous amount of corruption and control from corporations who are essentially running a lot of the scale of what is possible. I mean, we can look at the Build Back Better plan and the ways in which it was completely, initially we were looking at on the Build Back Better plan, real climate change scale. We were talking about climate justice, and then what ends up happening is they take out climate justice components, which include like free education, which includes like pathways for citizens, for immigrants. They remove all that, and they ended up putting double the amount of funding for roads, one of the most carbon intensive infrastructures. And, it was 100 million for roads, while only 50 million for climate adaptation. And then despite all that, despite those concessions, it was not even passed. And so when we look at what is realistic, we're seeing that the realities of what is realistic is more of the corporate control of these ideas. And I think it's very dangerous when corporations are invited to the table and are allowed to control the conversations, and why we have ideas like net zero is what was focused on in the last climate talks. Because I think a great example I can give just locally, I'm at a school of sustainability, and thanks to the defunding of public education, now the state only gives 15% to the funds. The university at 15% of its funding comes from the state. And so they've been required to take a lot of money from corporations and private interests. And so the School of Sustainability at my university has a lot of funding from the Walmart family. And so when Walmart is funding your education, it controls what you're allowed to talk about. And so we never talk about consumerism. In any of the work, we don't ever talk about how consumerism is an issue here. And so I think that's just one example of when corporations get to control the conversation, it limits the imaginations of what are we even allowed to discuss. And so I think on the national level, I think an international level, I think there's a need to work on the issues of getting money out of politics. And for example, in the United States, thanks to loopholes and corporations, corporations are considered have the same rights as people. And so when corporations have the same rights of people and they're able to fight in that way, I think we're not going to get progress. And I think that we also need to look at the fights to take away corporate personhood, the fights for a clean election, the fights for example, in the city of Seattle, they did these democracy vouchers where elections can be funded by the people. I think those are important. We need to essentially strengthen democracy and remove the corruption on the international and national scales before we can have a clean conversation, because these conversations are warped by the control of the dominant hegemony, which is both corporations, capitalism, and the colonial order. And so until these things are changed, it really limits the institutional imagination of what is even seen as realistic or possible. And so I think that's the problem on the national scale. Oftentimes, even with climate justice funding and otherwise, when you look at, how do we invest in climate justice? They're like, well, what if we just elect the right people? But, Obama wrote an essay in the Moral Ground Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril, right when he got into office, of talking about the future I want for my daughters. And in it, he describes how he wanted America finally free from the tyranny of oil. And as leader of the free world, what did he do? He opened up drilling and offshore drilling. And opened up more extraction of oil, even though personally he's writing about how he wanted to be free from the tyranny of oil. And so I think that speaks to the level of corruption on a national and international scale, where even when you elect politicians who do not want to see the continuation of this climate crisis, their hands are tied. Before Obama could even get into office, he had to take all this money from the Goldman Sachs, from all of these big banks. And then it doesn't really matter what he wants at this point, because he's controlled by the moneyed interest. And that's just one example on why I think that, trying to invest in electing the right person, it doesn't matter if you elect the right people. It's similar to good cops. It's not the idea of good cops or bad cops, it's the fact of a corrupt system. And so when you place them in there, they become corrupted. And so until we address this corruption on the national and international scale, we are really warped into, as far as what is even seen as possible on these levels, are very much more of the continuation of the status quo.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really good, and so many points. I can't take one of them out, but just thank you so much for that. I think in terms of time, I just want to pass the ball I spoke of once earlier over to Youssef, without trying to steer how he wants to respond to the discussions that we've had already. Youssef.
Yeah, I won't take too long, but I think I'll sort of respond to everything by saying that I see two narratives almost competing, and they coexist but go in different directions. It's schizophrenic, almost paradoxical. There's one positive narrative where see how much we've done. Look at the graphs showing the prices of renewables go down per kilowatt hour, and how awareness of the climate crisis has increased over the past decades, and how far we've gone. That's one narrative, which is the optimistic and positive one, because we have indeed achieved a lot. But then you have another one that's going in the opposite direction of perpetuating that old order that could still hinder the rate of progress, or even reverse it if economics so dictate. And look at how we are advancing in cleaning up the ocean, and in parallel we are littering space. It's exactly the same thing, but that's the schizophrenia we're operating in. And Joanna mentioned a really important factor, underlying factor, which is short-termism, and it works in the two clusters of impact. I mean, the groups of stakeholders that have the most impact in shifting our world are governments and basically big corporations, right? Governments have a basic mandate of advancing national interests. Big corporations have a basic mandate of maximizing shareholder equity. And neither of them is mandated to save the world, right? Unless it coincides with these other objectives, which is happening to some extent. And so look at how we teach economics and business. There's something called cost-benefit analysis. Inbuilt in that is a discount rate. What do discount rates do? They tell you that future earnings and losses carry less weight than current earnings and losses. So that throws intergenerational equity out the window. We teach our students that today, not yesterday. So they will grow up to still perpetuate the old narrative. And we just have to pray that the old economics are consistent with our future aspirations for solving the climate crisis or any other environmental ills that we find, unless we find ways to redefine these basic concepts, economics, business, politics, whatever. You don't need to destroy them, you just need to tweak them. I mean, look at, for example, national boundaries. They meant something 30 years ago that they don't mean today. Today, you have transfer of funds across boundaries, transfer of ideas, transfer of a lot of things that were not possible before. So maybe you can actually fix some of these things without a massive destruction of the whole discipline of economics or of the whole nation state or of the whole electoral system, but find ways to minimize the negative impact of how we've been doing things for hundreds of years on how we want to do things in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Youssef. Okay, wonderful. 2 rounds around the table, and we have 25 minutes left on the clock. I think I'd like to propose to open it up to the audience at this point, and you can put your questions in the comment box, or you can raise your hand, I think. But if we don't get any questions, I think it won't be difficult to take. Oh, we have a hand raised. Marcel, and well, let me say one thing first before we start, that in terms of time, because time flies, let's just answer, let's try to keep to 1 to 2 minutes when answering participants, if we get a question to go around the table, or if we get a direct question. Marcel, you have the floor.
Thank you. So this is something that might connect to Sarah's tea discussion regarding corruption and silencing in some sort. So I'm thinking, what implementations could you, respective scholars, suggest that could be considered radical or even risky regarding impacting the masses on the subject of climate change? You know, here I'm looking for like realistic suggestions that individuals and institutions in a position of power would be skeptical or even scared to, you know, take on, mainly because these implementations would or could have a negative effect on their position, status, wealth, and so on. So, you know, this is just something burning in my mind for some time, and I'm just checking if someone has a good comment on that.
Thank you, Marcel. You referred to Sarah, Marcel, but
I
think it's
like this could be connected what she was saying. I was not directing the question like on somebody specific, but if somebody has like something interesting and radical in mind, I would love to hear it.
Thank you. Is there a taker at the round table? Sarah, do you want to start us off? And or Joanna, you opened your mic, sorry.
Yeah, Joanna has a hand up.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to make sure I'd understood the question correctly and then answer if I had. Marcel, were you asking for suggestions about something radical but realistic that people in positions of power could do, something specific? Was that right? So I was just answering something in the chat, so I didn't quite hear.
I was meaning that that individuals or institutions in the position of power would be skeptical of or even scared to take on, because mainly this would have maybe a negative effect or impact on their position of power, their status, social status, their wealth. You know, just as many politicians and institutions are on the surface, they are saying like, yeah, we are going this nice, beautiful direction. Hey, take a look at us. But underneath, they are doing even the exact opposite, or just something that is giving them more wealth, or you know. So this was just my wondering, you know, regarding the corruption and silencing and.
Well, yeah, so
thank you, Marcel.
Yes, sorry for making you to repeat that. One thing, I'm not sure if this fully answers your question, but I think the most important thing that can be done, and it does challenge people's position of power right now, and Sarah mentioned it at the beginning, is divestment. I think at the moment we need to change where the money is going. And at the moment, the money is still going far too much towards the fossil fuel lobby and towards high carbon investments. And if people in power were to say, right, we are going to divest I'm going to divest my pension fund. I'm going to divest my institution's pension fund. I'm going to divest whatever I can from gas, from oil, from coal. That would make a huge difference, and it would be challenging to people's position of power, but it would make a real tangible difference, I think, to the low carbon transformation.
Yes, I completely understand. I've been diving quite into Australia's position and their fossil fuels consumption and all that, and I'm not the smartest kid in the world, but it is quite staggering, and really, because this is so many of them are privately owned companies. If they would just a little bit like say, okay, I don't need to be filthy rich, I can just be moderately filthy rich and have a really beautiful impact on future generations.
Thank you, Marcel. I don't see other hands or questions. And well, I see one more question in the chat, and we have just 20 minutes left. I would say this is a quite good thematic we can just keep with for the remaining 20 minutes, unless somebody has a burning question. And it goes along with the how do we make social change and changing the institutional imagination realistic. So if we maybe just keep to one last round around the table, and I'd give Sarra the word next.
Yeah, on the international scale, I know I mentioned it before, but I think it's important. Indubitably, if we're going to have climate justice, there needs to be a massive resource transfer. And so I'll say it again, there does need to be reparations. I know that that's often a conversation stopper in the West, but without that, we are not going to see the leapfrog development that is needed. And then if we look at, again, on the corruption and other ways, I think that there has to be limits of the power of corporations. And I think that there's a lot of different ways to do that. But I know that there's been times where, I was working on a policy in Seattle where we were going to essentially put a ban on combustible engines by 2030. And, big corporations heard of it and came in and said they were going to pull out if they did that. So we need to put more limits and more laws around corporations and their influence and their ability to be like, well, if you do something I don't like, I'm going to move my business, right? Because and that way they have too much control over the local. And then I think on the local side, I think that we really, I think budgets and where the city puts its money, similar to the work of divestment. I also think the work of investment. What are they investing? Where are their priorities? And you could see that in the budget. And so often we're seeing in budgets that sustainability has the smallest investment. And so, and similar to what I spoke of earlier in this talk of how climate change should not be positioned in one department, it should really be a lens through which we see everything, right? And so in order to do that, we do need to put huge amounts of funding and resources into this. And we also need to, I think that I remember in the climate policy we were working in Seattle, I was really trying to follow the best available climate science to put the dates on when we would put this ban on the combustible engine in our city. And, I was told like, this isn't politically feasible. And I was like, well, I'm not really interested in that. I'm looking at what the science says, right? And of course, political feasibility won. And so I think that's another thing that we really need, is that we need to really push as much as possible past what's politically feasible, because that is going to get us more of the status quo. And so some of these more radical ideas, it does need to be what's pushed forward. And I think that through the lens of resiliency, especially on the local level, we can make climate change, which is such a oftentimes a sectored issue, and we can broaden and bring more communities to the table with a climate resiliency lens, because we're addressing inequality, racism, we're addressing homelessness, we're addressing mental health. All of these issues are embedded into resiliency framework. And so I think that's one way to bring more people to the table, to build what we need is these broad-based coalitions. And so when we have the majority coming to the table and have their interest in this, then hopefully then we have the people power to push past what's politically feasible.
I think that's great. Yeah, pushing past what's politically feasible. And I guess my question there would be, can the institutional imagination go further than the political imagination at a certain time? And we have Perrin, Youssef, and Hannah left to speak in this round. Does anyone of you want to take the word?
Yeah.
Youssef?
Oh,
Hannah,
go ahead.
Hannah can start.
Oh, me? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I've been thinking a lot about the kind of sense that one of the challenges around climate change is that and particularly this thing about kind of changing mindsets, is the sense that there's a sort of conflict of interests, that there's an idea that in educating people or communicating to people about climate change, there's also a kind of imposition on people as to a particular kind of paradigm or way that they should act or live their lives. And so I've been thinking a lot about, like, how do we move and thinking about social change away from these sort of diktats about what people should do in a sort of ideal world into this kind of more kind of discursive space where we can actually understand the conditions within which that makes sense or doesn't make sense for people. And one of the things I think is kind of maybe not being done so much but could be done more is that we often, I mean, one of the things about climate change is it's partly because of the way in which we understand what climate change is that it's cast as something that's happening in the future, or that people are invited to think about climate change in terms of the imagination, in terms of what could be. We just heard the really great example from Sarah when she was talking about President Obama and saying, oh, I would love to live in a world where there was no fossil fuels, but it's all kind of projected into the future. But actually there's a real power in engaging in the kind of active diagnosis of the present and really trying to understand what we can do and what people can do in the present. And I think, again, it, you know, at the local level, you know, you've seen quite a lot of like local community activism, maybe not about climate change, maybe about like chemical pollution or about air pollution, or about how their people's kinds of experiences of inequality or living in a particular place can be transformed partly through a process of just diagnosing what the situation is like. Why is it like this? Why is it that there are these inequalities in this neighborhood? What are the histories of that? And I think there's scope to do more of that kind of work when it comes to climate change. So like, you know, what are the energy infrastructures? I think people just often don't, there's really little understanding of those infrastructural conditions. And if we want to build those kinds of, if there's going to be a kind of change in mindset or building of movements of from the bottom up to engage people in why climate change matters, then I think that's one way in which we could proceed.
Thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful. What I'm hearing is a focus on how climate change is always situated in a context, and we can work in that context in many different ways. It doesn't have to be specifically labeled as climate change, and could, you know, you have the justice angle that's so important and can amplify all kinds of other processes. Youssef, you had your hand up.
Yes, thanks. One thing I was thinking of is the importance of awareness, in the sense that in the past year, we've seen Extinction Rebellion, we've seen Fridays for Future, and this mobilization of power by the people, especially the youth, for whom the future and long-term thinking carries the highest stakes, is really important, and in many cases rides on the positive narrative and defies the old one. So many people go to a supermarket and pay extra to get that sustainability dividend for a product that doesn't offer additional functionality, but just contributes to being good. And I'm seeing a lot from my position here, a lot of young people probably choosing lower wages to enter into socially responsible companies, for example. So, I mean, this is a really important bright spot to capitalize on and to nurture to the extent possible. Maybe an easier way to change everything else than to try to attack the big centers of interest. So just wanted to bring this out, that we have this bright spot coming out of the youth and the emphasis on sort of non-economic values in making decisions, which could trickle up to the rest of the global community. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you, Youssef. Perrin, I feel like we haven't heard from you in a while. Would you want to join us?
I've been enjoying listening to the conversation, and especially listening to you, Sarah, talking about, on the one hand, capitalism, colonialism, and on the other hand, the need to work at the local scale, and just the vast, distance between those two, and those two frameworks is kind of overwhelming. And it gets back to this, question of, I think, that is really on target about, a 1.5 degree change target, or, a certain number of carbon, carbon concentrations in the atmosphere as a very particular target, and then the need for building broad alliances where climate becomes all of society and nature. And which one of these paths should we take? If there's just like incredible distance between these different scales. I'm serving on this Carbon Neutrality Committee at the University of Michigan right now. And it's been fascinating in that sense too, because on the one hand, the report that the university, the President's Commission put out is like, we're going to get to carbon neutrality. It's got all these target dates. Most of it is about, the kind of pipes that are going to carry new geothermal heat through the campuses. It's all very technical engineering language, and that seems to be where the change is going to happen. And then this is all framed within this new climate justice sort of framework about about local, paying attention to indigenous and local knowledge, and having reparations with Detroit, which is our neighbor to Ann Arbor here, doing all this stuff, and that is all this very diffuse sort of language that what does that have to do with the pipes that are going into the plumbing, and where billions of dollars are actually going to be invested, hopefully, in changing the infrastructure of the University of Michigan. What is the place of local indigenous knowledge in that sort of movement there? And that kind of gets pushed out to the side there. And yet, as an institution, the University of Michigan, loves to have 5 to 10 year targets that they're going to be able to meet these targets. They can show this as, when they're making pleas for donors to make funds, and they can show some sort of and they can get a work plan and do hiring and investments in these sorts of ways. So I do think there's a real tension between those. I personally have been so pleased with the move in the last 15 years from a sort of a sustainability focus to a justice focus in environment and climate. But I think that we also have to acknowledge the problem Joanna was talking about of taking on everything. You end up not taking on, you end up dispersing energy, and it's not right that, it's not true, I don't think, that the priorities that everybody holds on these things are the same. So you can end up, as left nonprofits in the United States have been in the last 5 years, really with an internal focus on well, how do we reform our institution, because this is an environment nonprofit, for example, but the environmental movement has a long legacy of white supremacy within it, and this is an environmental movement, but we should be taking on issues like homelessness, as Sarah's saying, which is true, but that there's a limited budget, there's limited resources, there's priorities within there, and it leads to tons of introspection and inter-movement politics that that maybe don't move at the speed of the urgency of the climate crisis. So that's not very optimistic, I guess. And I totally need optimism in my life right now. I'm just to make it through the day. But those tensions that I think is inherent in framing our political problem as global climate change, which are just such an overwhelming framework, and then trying to push all of our issues from the local to the regional to the national and the international into that framework. It's powerful, it's inspiring, it is also riddled with organizational and institutional issues, I think, too. So that's my spiel.
Thank you, Perrin. Okay, so we managed to go 3 circles, and I mean, it's been incredibly rich, so many ideas, both critical and generative. We have 5 minutes left, and we have questions, a few questions in the chat, which we won't be able to take directly. One from Andrew Hargrove about like what mechanisms can lead us there, and there's so many answers to that question. I know you all have, and we've been hearing around the table over these 2 hours. I wonder, as just an offer in the end, whether, and sort of coming from an anthropological perspective, whether any of our participants, and we probably just have time for one, so it's a bit of a pressure I'm putting on the roundtable. Does any of you have like just a beautiful story about climate change in institutions? Do you remember a moment, a recent or a moment long away, where you really felt that something beautiful was happening, and you don't need to rationalize it as the solution to the problem, but I think ending on one nice story would be nice. I know I'm putting immense pressure on you guys, and if you just give me silence, I'll figure things out. But it's an offer, and we can have a short silence after the offer.
I have a story I guess I could share.
Wonderful, thank you, Sarra.
So when I was working in Seattle with a climate justice nonprofit, we were working on a community-based participatory research project where we had this climate justice steering committee. We came up with a survey, and we wanted to survey specifically South Seattle, who is often left out of the conversation, where the majority of the people of color, immigrants, and a low-income community live. And so we wanted to get their opinion on what the most important thing around climate change, the biggest thing they were concerned of. And what we found was, after we conducted the survey in the community, we found that gentrification was the #1 issue, which really wasn't on our radar at all. And at first we were like, what do you mean this is a climate issue? But what we saw was that these communities with their networks and resources, especially immigrant and refugee communities that have built this infrastructure in South Seattle, were being pushed out of the communities, and in that losing their networks and becoming less resilient as they got pushed out and were no longer had their churches and their community centers and the like. And so when we realized that, okay, gentrification, okay, we're going to make gentrification a climate issue. So we started advocating on the city level. And through that, we were actually able to get the city to start an environmental justice council. And through that, we were then able to push for participatory budgeting and get money moved in to the council, that the Environmental Justice Council, which was built up of environmental justice leaders in the community, were able then to put money into these environmental justice projects, and that now has developed into a Green New Deal roundtable where they are taking a participatory budgeting approach and actually moving money into things like affordable housing and other things to increase the resiliency of these communities and address things, making sure that they have cooling centers and also resiliency hubs when natural disasters happen within the community. And so I think that this is a great example of like the ability of the potential of the institutional imagination when they really allow the community and listen to what comes up from the community. And I think that it's just been really inspiring to me. The work has continued on, and you know, we look on the national scale, and Green New Deal was actually banned through a resolution from Congress nationally. And yet locally, we are actually starting to build the world that we want to see.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for giving us that story. I think it's a great way to end this marvelous roundtable, how an institution can engage in politics and the local level and bring up something good and beautiful, bringing aesthetics to the table towards the end. But you also open up the question of class that we didn't touch upon a lot. There's so many discussions we could have from what you've been saying over these 2 hours. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, dear participants. It's been so lovely to have you here. I put a link to the other climate Sawyer workshops that are part of the Sawyer seminar. This is the first one of 3, and there are also other events in the Sawyer seminar. I hope you'll take a look at that. With that, I would just want to say a formal goodbye for the recording, and have a wonderful afternoon and evening in our different time zones.